So for this panel conversation on the day about the future, what we wanted to do was have something that was similar to what we did with the journal editors and society presidents yesterday in terms of questions, but wanted to keep them both focused on themes and approaches that we see in philosophy of science with special attention to trajectories into the future. What kinds of methods, what kinds of questions, what kinds of themes might be emerging, what might be understudied and require more attention, giving tips and clues to graduate students for dissertation topics. But that's the general tenor. Now, some of you are wondering because Holly does not look like Carl Craver. And that's a good thing. And I know Carl well enough to know he would appreciate that comment. But Carl was unable to be with us, and so Holly has kindly agreed to step in for the panel. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do now is sort of open up with a sort of methodological note. So thinking methodologically, how would you characterize the different extant approaches in philosophy of science? Do you think some of the diversity in these approaches presents a challenge to the field at this particular moment? And I'm happy to let whoever begin who would like to, and we'll hear from all three of you.
Okay, so apparently I'm going to start. First, I want to say I'm probably a little too gray-haired to be the future of philosophy of science, but I'm happy to address this question. I think there's an incredible richness of different approaches. There's historical cases, current cases, including embedded qualitative ethnographic research, contrasting cases, formal modeling, quantitative empirical study. It's fantastic, especially because when I was starting in philosophy of science, and even 10 years in, a lot of people were worried, oh no, we're all just becoming philosophy of special science peoples, and we won't be able to talk to each other in 10 years. Turns out, nope, not a problem. There is a lot of cross-cutting conceptual issues across different philosophies of special science, not just in my favorite area of values and science policy, but also in modeling and concepts of understanding, we heard about yesterday. There is no shortage. And I think that having the kind of diversity that we see in methodological issues is perfectly acceptable, especially because so many of the people who do different methodological approaches always seem to be able to preface quite clearly, okay, I'm doing this approach. Formal modeling is an as-if approach. I'm doing this one case study. It may or may not generalize. Everyone seems to understand that there are limitations to any of these approaches. No one can do them all. That's fine. Thank goodness we have some division of labor. And I think there's still a sort of general unity in philosophy of science because of an emphasis on conceptual analysis from these different cases, and always a combination of descriptive and normative concerns from these possible cases. So I'm not that worried about it. Maybe you are.
Do you want to go next?
I guess I can connect to this. Thank you, Heather, and thanks a lot again for the organization of this fantastic conference. I'm enjoying it enormously. So I would completely agree with Heather that we're seeing a lot of diversity. This is great. I think there's still a vast majority of us are focusing on conceptual analysis, but these can take different forms. It can have different methodological routes. I think we are at the beginning of a proper methodological reflection in philosophy of science. It's great that it's happening. It's partly indeed prompted, I agree, by this diversity, and I'm delighted to see this. I think a lot can be done there, and is indeed something that can bring us together across these different disciplines. But I mean, just to give you an example, one of the things that I think, it's come up already in this conference, but I think continues to be a source of preoccupation, and I think we are still, again, at the beginning of trying to reflect on how, what are the implications of some of this, is different forms of collaborating with scientists. This can happen in so many different forms, depending on the field, depending on the region and the territory you're actually working in, depending on the intended goals of those collaborations. Some people engage in them because they actually want to do science, right? Other people want to do so-called complementary science, to take Azuk Chang's term, and really try and supplement what the scientists are not doing. Other people are really strongly engaged in critique. We heard the feminist approach, of course, is well known for that, but there's lots of other approaches. Certainly, the global movement is also one that is really promising in that respect. And the institutional formats of those collaborations, of course, also presents all sorts of challenges, and they're very interesting to know. Right? And again, it'd be great if people were even more explicit in talking about this, right? Some of this happens through projects, and projects can be very different. Some of them are led by philosophers, and they have a certain kind of agenda. Others, many others, are the kind of thing where we are brought and tagged on because it's kind of nice to have a decorative philosopher. And these are very, very different prospects, opportunities sometimes, but also constraints. But there's also places where we engage through teaching. That actually probably is the most common thing that happens, particularly, I would say, in North America. And this, again, is lots of different affordances, lots of different resonances. And there's particular centers and institutions that are being formed, and some of them, of course, are long-standing, to encourage those collaborations. And I think having an ever more explicit reflection on how the methods we're using speak to our own different institutional positioning and the ways in which we're relating to science is really important.
All right, thanks. So I'm improvising a little bit, and it'll be somewhat less organized, but thank you for the opportunity to say some things on this, because I had been thinking one of the things that hasn't really come up in the theme so far, we've talked about the relationship of philosophers of science with various kinds of scientists, and somewhat with philosophers of science and each other, including with historians of philosophy of science. And one of the things that's really notable, I think, since COVID is it actually used to be really hard to get somebody on your dissertation committee who wasn't at your school. And nowadays, nobody thinks there's anything weird about having someone Zoom into a meeting. And so trying to do that before was really hard. And I think that now we're having a lot more, like, why don't we have a Zoom meeting and talk about this for 2 hours? And you can do that on a regular basis, and you used to have to go to conferences to do that. So I think there's a lot more awesome opportunities for actual collaboration with each other that we didn't have before for just like purely logistical reasons. And it's made me think more about what is it that we do when we're in the same room together? Like, why is it that sometimes you don't want to do it on Zoom and you want to actually be here? And the really lively discussions over coffee and things like this, I think, are part of it. But another thing that hasn't really come up so far that I think is interesting and I think has improved in my time in philosophy of science is the relationship between philosophy of science and philosophy as like the rest of the discipline. So I think that we have more credibility now than we used to, say, 10, 15 years ago. And we've really started to be kind of recognized as bringing something distinctive and useful and not just pop science. And we get a lot fewer of the questions, I think, from our colleagues these days, like, how is this really philosophy? And I think this is an awesome opportunity also sort of looking forward, because we do bring, for example, teaching breadth requirements that lots of people across the universities and deans are seeing as extremely useful. And that gets us to help students who are doing science, but also interact with more colleagues over there, and also facilitates, our own department succeeding. And so I think there's still some challenges. I'll talk about that later, but I think there's some really interesting things that we should also think about how we relate to the broader field of philosophy, where most of us still work in departments that are called philosophy.
So that brings up a nice comparative point, because you're sort of looking back to where we were and where we've come from. So maybe invite all three of you to kind of touch on that very concretely. How does philosophy of science today compare with a philosophy of science from a generation ago, both with respect to themes and approaches? Because I think we've seen both arguments for continuity and some arguments for discontinuity during the time that we've been here. And maybe what does that suggest for the next decade? Does it suggest that continuity manifested in different ways, or is it clean breaks or really distinct frontiers that will be broached?
We have started. Okay. So I guess for me, a very distinctive change with respect to what I perceived the previous generation to be is the fact that I'm sitting here. I'm still in shock, actually, by this when I think about this, because I spent a lot of my graduate years and subsequent years being told by very many senior figures in the field that I certainly wasn't a philosopher of science. If I was anything, it would have been an historian, and I had this very worrying tendency to worry about real science and what was actually happening in the sciences, and this didn't really belong in philosophy of science. And I had these in referee reports, even like one of my books, like the data-centric biology book, one of the referee reports basically said this book is not about realism, so therefore it's not philosophy. And yeah, so I think, my perception is there has been a shift towards actually making it not only feasible, but in fact welcome for people to engage in actual scientific practices across the spectrum, in all the subspecialties of philosophy of science, in physics, across to biology, across to climate science, environmental science, and so forth. And for me, that has been a huge shift, because of course, this can include any approach, from very, very formalistic to highly historicized. But the fact that I'm now, perfectly able to have whole teaching programs which are based on that premise, for me is a really good development in this generation that I personally experienced, hostility towards when I was being trained.
You go, and then I'll go.
Okay. It's hard because I'm not sure who I'm supposed to be, like who was a generation ago, like who counts as old enough to be old enough. But when I was a grad student.
Not gray hair. Don't use that one.
Oh, no, but I know, because yeah, we're all getting there.
I earned every one, damn.
Yes. One thing that I've noticed that makes me sometimes feel sort of old-fashioned is that I think, at least the way in which I was trained, there was a kind of synoptic broadness to the way people approached their topics, where you were working on this area, but you were very amenable to the idea that it would connect to this topic over here or this topic over here, and you kind of needed to know not just the contemporary stuff happening on it, but also a lot of the historical stuff. And so there used to be a way in which I felt like, you could ask a question and get in a seminar and get sometimes really unexpected answers, like, oh, that's a good idea, but also did you know that so-and-so said that in 1582, so you should go read Suarez or something. And you're like, okay, and then you read it and you think, aha, this is in fact exactly the thing that I was looking for, and I'm not the first person to have this thought. And it's really helpful to have those kinds of discussions. And so I, as you could probably tell from my hand-wavy talk, I think there's something really valuable about the synoptic view that we used to take. And so while I think there's also lots of good, we're no longer sort of border policing what counts as real philosophy of science or what the real topics are, we still, and I know this is just telling you to do more reading, but there's lots of, I think, really good sort of historical stuff that we can draw on. And I've discovered there's lots of sort of parallel discussions outside of philosophy of science where sometimes we're a little bit reinventing the wheel that they were already doing over here. And they do have some really useful conceptual resources in some of these other fields. And so sometimes philosophers of science are a little dismissive about what's happening in these other fields. And I share in this, I criticize some of the stuff, but at the same time, there's also really valuable discussions to have. Not just with sort of historical depth, but also with sort of breadth across different areas.
So when I was a graduate student, there was no values in science work being done. Feminist philosophy of science was just starting to move from the margins into legitimacy. Tamara Harwitz taught the first course in feminist philosophy of science at Pitt to see if there was anything good there in 1994. She discovered there was. It was very cool. I wasn't meaning to write a dissertation on values in science. It's just what I was trying to understand why scientists disagreed, and it turned out it was because of values in science. And then when I was working in this area, I submitted a paper to PSA 2002 on the moral responsibilities of scientists, and it was just rejected outright because it wasn't philosophy of science. I submitted to the APQ, American Philosophical Quarterly, unedited, and they accepted it without change. So it was a bad paper. It was just not philosophy of science to talk about the moral responsibility of scientists. Today at PSA, we have amazing sessions on trust in science, science policy, responsibilities of science, scientific limitations, limits on science, science communication, politics in science, scientific integrity. It is all philosophy of science to be considering moral issues in science, political issues in science, epistemic issues in science. And guess what? As philosophers of science, we're the best at considering that entanglement of all the normativities in science. We're better than research ethics people at thinking through ethical and epistemic issues. Because, man, when I read that literature, I'm like, what are you doing? So and this actually, the most exciting thing to me about this change, and it's a huge change, now I have to make choices about what to go to at PSA. Like which session? Oh my God, there are so many interesting ones. But science policymakers and scientists are really interested in these issues. They are struggling with these issues. They want philosophical clarity on these issues. And it's not, you don't have to. You can just do the M&E part of philosophy of science and have a wonderful life and career, as we saw. I'm not going to say you have to do it all entangled. But if you want to, it's now possible, and there's a whole community to support that work.
All right, so I want to nudge you into the future, because you mostly were comparing the past to the present. And so maybe one way I can nudge you into the future is to say, what is the most exciting thing that you see on the horizon? What is the thing that gets you out of bed in the morning, so to speak? Excited to work with graduate students and to see these lines of investigation developing in the next few to 5 years.
So I'm really lucky because I live in British Columbia and the greater Metro Vancouver area, and I feel like there's lots of general cultural discussions that are happening there that are really fantastic, and that all my undergrads and most of my grad students show up just ready to do. And and we see what's on our horizon, and I'm looking at Kabir. So we're gonna. I think that the global turn is in fact really important, although I think it's harder, so I appreciate the optimism of it, but I think it's harder to sometimes get into this sort of stuff because there's a lot of resources that we're going to have to draw on that are in fact from outside of what we conceive of as philosophy of science. So there's a lot of things like critical decolonial lenses that other people have developed well, and we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past when we can avoid the mistakes of the past because other people came up with ways for us to sort of do a better job with that. So I feel like there's lots of just really exciting discussions and lessons that are, people are sort of ready to take on and then do this kind of integrated history and philosophy of science with this other kind of lens. And so there, especially in the 19th century and the early 20th century, it's literally just the period of colonization, especially in North America, both in the United States and this sort of competing one in Canada with the British. And it turns out all of this stuff was really shaping what people like Peirce were doing. And it was really shaping, we sort of came up with the train. I mentioned the trains yesterday, but I think that's a really sort of central part. Even in thermodynamics, the shape that those laws took was entirely shaped by the fact that there was so much money to be made by sending your trains faster across North America to put out economic refugees as immigrants and then bring back, minerals and, trees, essentially. So there's these really interesting ways in which it's right there next to what we're doing, but we have to sort of draw on these outside, I think, conceptual resources and advice that we can get from outside of philosophy of science in order to sort of bring that in a good way.
Right, yeah, so for me, actually, in a sense, resonates with what Holly was saying, but for me, the thing that really gets me out of bed is the fact that we are, trite, but we are living in a very serious moment of crisis for humanity. We are in the greatest environmental crisis ever seen. And this really brings in, calls for resources that we have as a community, which I think are really important and open up a huge space for incredibly exciting new work. And part of this is indeed questions around injustice, discrimination, and post-colonial heritage. These need to be addressed. This is absolutely core to try and think about what is the role of science and technology in the context of a planetary crisis, taking account of geopolitical issues and taking account of the cultural diversity that we want to be able to speak to and take account of when we're thinking about science and technology. But on the other side, it also speaks to this big question of integration, which I would agree with Heather that I'm much more optimistic now than I used to be about our field being able to communicate with each other about the different work we're doing on different areas. But I'm actually not very optimistic about what's happening in the sciences themselves. Right? I think there are really significant issues, more and more, in fact, around getting even very small subdomains to speak with each other. There are big standardized platforms and initiatives that get advertised left, right, and center, and I see them failing one after the other, or anyhow encountering huge difficulties where the gap between the big advertisement of, we do science for the global challenges and is all interdisciplinary, and what's actually going on in the everyday practice of scientists is actually becoming much, much bigger, not to speak of how it intersects with the digital divide, which is a whole topic in and of itself. So I think that really does present us, and certainly students and people who are now coming in the profession, with so many opportunities to apply the richness of our scholarship to these questions around, how do we make sure that a mathematical biologist can work with somebody working in data science and somebody who's working on environmental issues to tackle something which is really urgent. What are the models? What are the data formats? What are the theoretical conceptions that we need? What are the forms of logic that may be required? All of those things are just ripe for the picking at the moment with urgency.
The thing that gets me really excited is thinking about the institutional structures that actually shape science, and thinking about how to actually change those or recommend changes so that we do better science and science that might actually be better for society, including addressing issues of injustice and historical injustices. The old social contract for science was really bad for these things, as I have been discovering as I unpack the 20th century construct that came out of World War II and then colonized science policy across the world, because the US system was the one that everyone kind of took up, unfortunately. And then what should it be? What should it be instead? What should we go forward with? Thinking through those issues, including how science gets funded, what scientific responsibilities, what responsibility in science actually should look like, and what that should mean for scientific practice. And doing actual studies of the impact of science on society, looking at it from the lens of different institutional structures and how that shapes what science is done and how it's done, and which ones are actually better for addressing things that really matter. That's like the rest of my career, and hopefully lots of other people's, because there is no way I'm doing this by myself.
So some of you know that I'm not a tremendously large fan of thought experiments and the intuitions that emerge from them. I think there's a few other people in the room who have similar sorts of orientations. But I'm going to propose a thought experiment. And the thought experiment also involves what we might think of as complicated political assumptions. And I want us to, as much as possible, bracket those for just a moment. Because what I want to ask each of our panelists is, if you had a venture capitalist or someone who had a large bag of money, willing to back you in offering a initiative or project of some kind that would be transformative for philosophy of science research in the coming years, what would you want? What kinds of ways do you think that money could be well spent? And again, I don't want to endorse the funding model. I just want you to know that there are lots of funds at your disposal in thinking about this question. And I'll flag this with a particularly distinctive note. We will come to talk to the center directors this afternoon. But when you saw Bennett put up the initial budget for the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science of $80,000 in 1952, that's less money than the budget is for me today. So now, obviously, he didn't get all of that, but the amount he got is more in real dollars today than I get. And I think that some of our thinking about the discipline is sometimes constrained by the fact that we don't maybe have the money we would like to have to be able to do things. So this is part of my motivation for the thought experiment, is I really want to say, if we had that opportunity, if we really could sort of work on a larger palette because of available financial resources, what kinds of things would you like to see?
I have lots of opinions. So as a graduate student, I was really influenced by being close to the Center for Philosophy of Science, because there were new people all the time. And it was really great to just get to be there, but also have people around. And one of the things that I think is really important about a center is getting to be there for a while. And then the other thing that was really important when I was a grad student was actually the Center for the Study of Mind and Nature at the University of Oslo. And they do kind of just get like insane amounts of money in Norway. And they have these research centers of excellence, and they last for 10 years, and they did amazing things because they had so much money that they could afford to just like, you could email them and say, hey, we're going to be in town. And they're like, all right, here's your salary and your office, but you're expected to go to this like, talk with so-and-so. And they had amazing people who came through and did like week or 2 week long things. So I think there's really something to having that kind of model. And I think that it can be, part of what was really nice is that you got to talk to people both doing European stuff, sort of in those circles, and in the North American area, and bring them together. And so I think that having a kind of model where that sort of thing goes on is really important. And for me, I think that we really should start doing stuff on like causal modeling. We should have a center for like causation somewhere. And it should be something where you bring in people from different areas. So just looking ahead at the PSA, my symposium talk, I read this really great paper on Real Talk About Gender by Robin Dembroff, and realized how useful this idea of ontic injustice is for this modeling thing that I'm doing about like Squamish, British Columbia. And so I think those surprising combinations of people coming in would be really helpful. And then, you don't know what happens over the lunch break and after like repeated discussions. So that's what, yeah.
Yeah. So I am torn, because part of me wants to do exactly this kind of thing where you have a center for socially engaged philosophy of science, something like that. And we have a little informal center at MSU, but we have zero money, like precisely zero. We do everything just because TED organizes it, and sometimes the Department of Philosophy gives us some money to do it, like take someone out for dinner. That's it. There is zero budget. It'd be nice to have like an actual budget, because I'd like to be able to support graduate students and postdocs and longer stays and just like flexibility around the churn, the intellectual churn, for informal and distributed collaboration. I also would really like to know, for example, what impact different kinds of funding models have on science for societal impact, and the distribution of cognitive labor in science. I would also like to know, do research ethics consultations actually help produce more societally responsible science? That would require the kind of big money that you would get to do a big Carol Lee style quantitative study. So I don't know, could I do both?
I think there would be enough money.
So this is great. I guess you said to be ambitious, right? So I'd say what would be really interesting for me would be to, have the opportunity to totally redo the whole of the infrastructure that we're using in our field. Meaning, the intersection of journals, databases. I know people don't want to hear about it, but they're pretty important. And there's all sorts of questions about archival sources, both for history, but also for the materials that we are now more and more bringing together in philosophy, like all sorts of different type of data sets that we are using, which don't have a home. And I have all sorts of ideas about how this could be done, but I think basically it really needs to be done. And I would like this to be, venture capitalists, totally publicly available, kind of open, non-for-profit, like in a way that now we don't have. I mean, all of our infrastructure in the field is commercialized. All of our infrastructure is in the hands of, large corporations we have absolutely no control over in a context which is the humanities don't count for almost anything. So it would be great to have a handle on our infrastructure and actually put it together so that it facilitates exactly these kinds of within discipline and cross-disciplinary collaborations. And in fact, I would push it even further. I would like to make it into some sort of public science realm where what the philosophers are doing is to provide a platform, a sort of coordinating role and a kind of platform for dialogue among many more types of people, including, most importantly, I think, people who are doing fantastic scientific work outside of the realm of academic science, of which there are very, very many. We have looked very little at these types of scientific work within our field, and I think is absolutely crucial. That's certainly something like we're now trying to put together in Munich, but with no venture capitalist resources. But I think doing something like this on a very large scale, bringing in those kinds of collaborations with the right tools to carry them out, to record and to document them would be really great.
So, back to reality now. Away from the thought experiment, maybe this is where the rubber hits the road, which is advising the next generation of scholars, the graduate students and the postdocs that you supervise. And I think maybe just to focus that, articulate one major opportunity and one major obstacle that you want to make sure that your students and advisees see, kind of eyes wide open, both as an encouragement and as a calibration for their careers.
Okay, so I have a lot of thoughts about this. The most important thing to realize is that tenure lines in the US at least, I think North America generally, maybe across the world, are decreasing. There's administrative bloat, and there's an increase of what's known as the precariat. Okay, so the job market sucks. And it's not going to get better. Right, 2025, apparently there's supposed to be this big demographic shift where suddenly there are fewer students to go to universities in the US. Okay, so then how do you decide what to do? The thing you should not do is try to gamify your work for the job market. That is a terrible idea. It is a soul-destroying idea. It is not worth it. There is no way you can predict what specializations are going to be popular in 2 to 3 years. And at the same time, what you write your dissertation on is what you say you're going to care about for the next decade if you get into a postdoc and then a tenure line, at least. Because you cannot change your research topic sort of before tenure with ease. It's very risky. You can do it, but wow. As all of you who are in your first year or second year of job, you're spending all your time developing courses, not revamping your research program. And then you've got just a couple of years for a tenure. Okay, so how do you do this? What I tell my students is to think about work that you enjoy doing, that you're good at doing, and that you think is valuable. And you find that intersection. And you do that, and then if things go south, it still was worthwhile. Like if it doesn't produce the thing that you wanted out of a career, it wasn't a waste of your time, because it could very well otherwise be a waste of your time. And that is the worst possible outcome for spending time getting a degree in philosophy. That's what I have to say.
That was kind of what I was going to say too, which so thank you. There's really no way to predict, and you really have to spend so many years doing this. So also this connects to what Janet was saying yesterday. Like regardless of what comes out of it, it has to be something that you really enjoyed doing and that you really would have done regardless of the outcome. And I know that sounds easy to say on this side, but it was a thing that I was told also in graduate school, and it worked out really well because it turns out then you're just a lot more excited about the thing that you're working on, and people can tell. And then you can get other people more excited about it because you have exciting things to say about this thing because you're really excited about it. So it is, in some sense, also a better path. I also think there's really good opportunities to do, and this is how I tell people to write. You know, term papers, I have a master's program and people have to write professional papers. There's like really good things that you can just go sort of like find in some other field or find in a historical lead up to how you got to the topic. If you just take however long people usually use to introduce whatever debate you're using, add 50 years to it, and you'll probably understand that debate much better. And also there was probably something really insightful that someone said 50 years ago that you can sort of polish up and add like IAN at the end, and now you've got the so-and-so Ian account of such and such. And it's a really good way to get like very good ideas that have sort of been kind of lost and are just sitting there. So there's really interesting connections to other fields outside of philosophy of science. And so finding how your topic intersects with something is always a reliable formula. But also like taking a longer historical lead up is also a really good formula for finding some really good stuff that maybe was on a slightly different topic or needs to be redone, but you're ready to redeploy it. So I think there's lots of good existing resources out there that you can use to make it more, you can use to sort of put two things together. Oh, yeah.
Well, I couldn't agree more with both of you. And I would say maybe, like, just to add, one of the things that could be an extremely interesting resource to use at the moment, exactly to do this kind of work, but, where your heart leads you and do it in this way that's really informed by what has happened in history and across places, is use AI, but not to do literature searches. It's terrible. Use AI to translate. I think that's a fantastic thing that we can now do more and more. That's something that I think some journal editors were starting to think about. How do we do automated translations, of course, of abstracts, for instance, so at least we can actually look at what has been happening, both historically and at the moment, in other territories, other languages that concerns philosophy of science. I think that opens up all sorts of really interesting avenues to actually work in the way that we've been discussing, more global, more interdisciplinary. At the same time, it also raises the challenge that actually, Holly, you already mentioned it, and I think it's a huge challenge for this generation of scholar, is the amount of scholarship. Because of the growth of the field, that's been mentioned many times over the last couple of days, our field has grown enormously, and with it, the whole of science. So we are now looking at a mountain of scholarship that people have to climb and trying to find their way into when starting on any topic. And that's really an interesting challenge, right? Which I think we're all struggling to find ways to think about this. I mean, I think a lot of people have editorial positions now, see a lot of papers coming in for graduate students that sometimes don't even cite the core, most obvious literature that they could be citing for certain topics. And I think there's very reasonable reasons for this, right? It's because it's actually sometimes hard to go back to this and think about what are the real building blocks of our profession. I mean, it presents an opportunity because it's a moment in which we have to really, really think deeply about, indeed this question, what constitutes a core resource, what constitutes a source of inspiration, possibly without this baggage of always thinking about demarcation, right? So do it in a way that's a bit more free. But it's certainly, I think, methodologically and also in terms of opportunities, really thinking about sources and what are we reading, both historically and in contemporary terms, is really a big question at the moment, and which tools we're going to use to do this.
Okay, our conversation has likely stimulated, if not provoked you in certain ways. And now I'd like to have an opportunity for the general audience to join the conversation through questions and discussion, and be as succinct and brief as you can so that we can get to as many comments as possible. And let's start over on this side, JP. Janet. Yeah, start with Janet.
Thanks for this. I wanted to push back a tiny bit on Heather's advice. Just little things that jump out at me that I'd like you to explore a little bit. So you mentioned tenured lines are decreasing and the job market sucks. Actually, only one kind of job market is implicated there, and that's the academic job market. So that's a thing I'd like you to maybe unpack a little bit. And the other piece was about the impending demographic cliff that's supposed to hit our enrollments. It turns out, I have learned recently, that the demographic cliff really mostly only applies to the groups that have traditionally been well represented in our colleges. So it's a demographic cliff of white college students mostly. So, you know, how should that influence how we think about how we go into the future with our field?
Okay, so you were absolutely right. I was thinking about academic jobs. Unfortunately, even for graduate students at MSU, where we have an entire engaged philosophy internship program in the summer where you can go and do field philosophy funded by us, they still end up wanting academic jobs after writing the PhD. They're like, well, that was fun. I want to keep doing that. Okay. And I don't blame them. It is fun. The non-academic pathways are still obscure, but plural. And I think part of that's like not a surprise, that there are lots of different ways to end up doing something related to a PhD in philosophy of science out in the world, in the NGO sector and government sectors and for-profit sectors, in building your own business sectors, like Ravit Dotan is doing with Responsible AI. She has her own consulting firm, and she's doing great. She's going to be making more than I am soon. So there's a lot of ways to do that. And one of the things I think is really difficult for non-academics is to see all of those pathways from the position of the university and to support students in finding those pathways. It's really complicated, and it's something that, you know, we should share more about. The demographic cliff, I think, is just a population level thing, combined with a decrease in seeing the value of a university education, because universities have been marketing themselves as primarily job training, which of course they're not that great at, because most for-profit companies are like, please don't try to job train the students before we get them. We'd like to do our own job training, just give them a background of education. So there's this kind of collision of what the value of university education is with, like, at least there is an overall population decline. Yep. Maybe we can recruit more students, but then we have to be more honest about what a university education's for. Whether or not that recruits more students, I have no idea.
Yeah, go ahead, Holly.
I'm going to add the Canadian perspective from here. SFU is really super not like a white school, and that's understatement of the year. And one of the things that's really awesome about being in Canada is that I can get students who can't get into the United States. And they are amazing and they're awesome. And I don't think like US-based people always realize how hard it is for people to get visas. And how many people don't get to come to programs because we're holding them in United States cities. And then there's like a 3-year wait list to even get into the consulate or wherever to get the visa. So I have students who just don't even apply. I have somebody who would have been great at the PSA, and he's just not going to go because he had no option to get there. And so at SFU, we have like whole groups of people who really specialize in pressuring the government to make sure that our students get visas and that we have better visa situations. And I feel like a lot of US schools have really not thought about this. So I remember in grad school, there were people who had a really hard time, and there wasn't a lot of people at the university to help with it. So you can be whatever Senate committee you're on or other organizational thing, or you're talking to your dean, really just bring up this issue of visas, because you can get a lot of people who would like to come, but they can't get a visa. So consider like the international population would really like an opportunity to come study with us, and they currently don't have it for entirely logistical reasons, which might change a lot depending on what happens with the US election.
And I mean, just to add to this, I think for anybody who has the opportunity, I mean, what I found certainly both in Exeter and now in Munich is when we can, going around some of the institutional structures we are in, hosting as many people as we possibly can, providing as much resources as we possibly can that we take from other places, so that people can come not as formal students, but just people who visit for a time, is being incredibly constructive and really fruitful in generating this kind of international dialogue wherever I've been, and it's always been very difficult to do it. But basically, we've always done it without quite maybe some parts of our institutional structure noticing just how much we're doing this, but that's been really, really fruitful. So basically, that allows you to eschew like some of those issues around, you know, how much funding you need and like the limits of the funding, like for actually hosting people that come and spend several years with you, but still have these kinds of encounters, and similarly trying to basically, I mean, if not travel, at least Zoom as much as possible in different places in the world where we can encounter different student populations. I mean, I certainly try to prioritize that now over other types of meeting, because I think for me, I just learn enormous amounts, and it's just incredibly rich to see how many different things are happening in the world. We now have the kind of more East Asian Philosophy of Science Association being formed. The Indian meeting happened last year. That was just fantastic. I mean, there's so many opportunities to engage with people and with students beyond. The other thing I want to say is that at least, I mean, in my experience, it's true that there is still this idea that the academic career may be the best. But I don't know, maybe I'm just being dismissive of our field, I hope not. But in the graduate populations I've been mentoring and dealing with, just making sure that even before they start their PhD, it's absolutely crystal clear to them, not only that academic careers are tough and they're very hard to get, but actually there's so many really cool jobs out there. It's kind of worked. I would say half of my PhD students have gone on, or maybe over half, to careers that were well outside of academia. And that, to me, is a huge source of happiness, because I think it's great to see them just branch out and having all sorts of jobs where they doing wonderful things in different sectors of society. So I think it's feasible for us, but it does take, you know, I mean, on the side of senior kind of mentors, a determination to make that argument in circumstances where, I mean, I don't know, I get the impression maybe, especially in North America, but generally there is this idea that, gosh, I mean, success means the academic career. And that's a really terrible perception, I would say.
Okay. Connor?
This question's, again, mostly for Heather, but other folks should feel free to obviously answer. I was going to ask, how do you convince 3 different groups of people that they're actually, in science, that they're actually making value judgments and that it matters? So my experience talking mostly to statisticians is that they don't think that they're actually making any sort of significant ethical or political judgments. Just as a quick anecdote, I co-teach a class with a statistician. On the first day, we had a colleague from political philosophy give a talk, and then after he was done, she said, you know, don't worry for the stat students, you know, these very deep ethical and political issues don't arise in the rest of the class. And on the rest of the syllabus, like, we have units on gerrymandering, election integrity and auditing, and so on. Okay, so talking to scientists and statisticians about the fact that their work is really ethically loaded, like, how do we do that? And same question for undergraduates and for high school and middle school students. So if you've never run a search for, like, fact versus opinion and look at the diagrams that are circulated to American children, right? Let me just tell you, you should do it and see that, you know, under the fact you see, look for number words, look for scientific words, and then under the opinion, it's every evaluative term, look for words like good and bad. And so we get this distinction taught to middle school children in our classrooms. And so the question is, how do we undo that?
Okay, so when I talk to scientists, usually happily, I've talked to scientists who are disagreeing with each other and then pointing out the value judgments that are involved that shape the disagreements. It's really easy, right? Like, you know, when scientists are worried about overregulation versus underregulation, pointing out that that's an ethical judgment, they're like, oh yeah, of course it is, but I'm not supposed to talk about it that way. But it is, isn't it? Shit. Okay, so, sorry about that. That's for posterity.
We are recording.
Yeah, well, okay. The way I teach science as ethically loaded, so I teach this big undergraduate class that they have to take because it's an interdisciplinary arts and humanities class and it's a required core class on responsible science and society. We start with Hempel. It's a great place to start. But by the second part of the class, we're doing human subject research, and we're talking about Tuskegee, and we're talking about Henrietta Lacks. And they're like, whoa. And then we talk about the atomic bomb. And then we talk about dual-use research, and we talk about commercial research. And by the end, no one thinks science is this non-ethically loaded thing, that it's shot through with ethical and political considerations, properly so, and that, frankly, scientists aren't entirely trustworthy. when it comes to doing this stuff well. I try to leave them with some good examples that scientists aren't all terrible. That I don't even give them Douglas on inductive risk. I don't have to, right? It's just so apparent on the things that I center in the class. They're like, yeah, okay, we see. I don't know, maybe a course like that needs to be taught. Okay, so the way in which to get the change is to change how K through 12 education goes. The fact that we teach science as a collection of fixed facts with answers in the back of the book for K through 12 is super dumb, because most of them are not going to become scientists. There's no reason to try to fill their brains with scientific facts that may or may not last their lifetime, because scientific facts change. Epigenetics is the key example in my lifetime. And to teach science as an actual practice of inquiry, starting in K through 12. There are examples of this. There's all this emphasis on nature of science stuff, where it's actual practice of inquiry. Somehow that never gets instantiated in the curriculum. Somehow chemists are like, no, we have to teach the periodic table and chemical balancing equations because every citizen needs to know that. No. But that's like a huge project. And I've talked to people in science education about this and like, yeah, we've been trying to get this change happen for decades, and there's just no movement. I don't know how to change that. That's above my pay grade. Do you want to say anything?
We can.
Like maybe some questions for these two.
Yeah, I was going to say, we've got a lot of questions. Why don't we keep moving? So, JP, why don't you go here in the middle?
The other microphone died.
Oh,
So
okay.
we
So,
have
yeah.
one.
So I'm thinking about something Janet mentioned yesterday about the material conditions that philosophers of science kind of face, and this idea, this point about the lack of tenure-track jobs. And so we've been really research-focused, but I'm also thinking on the teaching side. And so there are going to be many people who get PhDs who end up in teaching track positions or community colleges, maybe without research funds, maybe with really high teaching loads. And so what could we do as organizations, right, PSA, centers, POPOS, to make sure that if you end up in a non-research oriented job, that you can still stay involved in conferences like this, for example. So it might be really difficult for someone who is teaching, 5 classes a semester to take time off to come to a conference like this. And they might really regret it. And if you're unable to come to conferences like this, you could quickly fall out of the loop. So how do we keep the folks who are coming out of PhD programs or MA programs, teaching community colleges, teaching track jobs, involved in things like this, because they might have really nice things to say, but otherwise not the resources to engage. Yeah. So just, yeah.
I have many opinions. Can I take this one? Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So, because I teach at this MA program, and it's really awesome. And part of what we do is really give people a space to, in a non-judgmental way, decide if they want to go to an academic conference or into an academic career or not. And we run about 50%. And what I just found out, because sometimes they come back and they come to our talks and they're on the colloquia emailing list. And for a lot of them who stay in the area, because a lot of them are trying to get permanent residence, for example, in Canada, so that they don't get sent back to a problematic home country. I just found out that 5 of our MA students are teaching at Langara College. There's a whole bunch of small colleges that are around there, and they all really enjoy it. And one of the things that we don't, I think, do often enough is talk about teaching. So even when we send our MA students to PhD programs, they're like, wow, nobody gave me any intro whatsoever. Like, I started teaching at Pitt, and they're like, here's your recitations. I'm like, what's a recitation? And nobody even told me. They were just like, just show up at that room in time, you'll figure it out. And we really, at our, which, was true. I did, sort of. But it it was a little more high stress than it needed to be. And we spend a lot of time sort of like, our students are primarily, they're all funded, because that matters when you're coming from different kinds of country backgrounds with different kinds of currencies. And they're mostly funded through teaching. And they're really good TAs because we take teaching really seriously. And what we discover is there's a lot of people who really enjoy the teaching and get a lot out of it and find it very fulfilling and don't want to have the pressure of publications. And we don't make space for people like that to talk about teaching and have fun ideas about it and discuss it with other people and put other things on there. So I think we can do a lot more for people who discover that what they like about philosophy and philosophy of science is the teaching part and not the pressure to do research. And so in that sense, I think having in some of these bigger conferences, more discussions around teaching, because there's a lot of people who would like to be able to do that, and they kind of don't want to have that pressure. Like, they see how high pressure it is, and they see how busy we are, and they're like, actually, no, I don't want to sign on for this, but I love my teaching. And so, like, making more space for that, I think, at our conferences and in our discussions, like, how can you really make, I have this great philosophy and science fiction class that I can tell you all about, and I think all philosophers of science should teach something like it. And like, you know, but I don't usually get to talk about that with other professionals. I only talk about it with people who are like teaching oriented.
Maybe just to add, I mean, there are resources. So there is an international society that looks at pedagogy and education for science and technology. And now ISHCA-BIBO, so the International Society for the History, Philosophy, and Social Studies of Biology, for those of you who are not in those fields, I'm sorry, yes, is actually trying to collaborate directly with them and make sure that we have a slot in our conferences always for those interactions which are specifically for pedagogy. I think this is something that we really can do, and I completely agree that it's important to foster it going forward.
Okay, let's go to the back corner over here.
In view of the future, might you comment on the tension between normative philosophy of science and descriptive philosophy of science, coupled with the tension parsing philosophy of science into a philosophic-centric philosophy of science and a science-centric philosophy of science. So the normative descriptive, I'm thinking in particular like contrasting Lakatos, Popper, or Mertonian and socioepistemology norms versus John Losey's work. And in terms of science versus philosophic, a philosophic-centric paper would start off situating the problem in the history of the philosophy literature, and a science-centric would be talking about the history of science, the sociology of science, the cultural and political context of science.
I don't think there's a tension. I think you can, I'm very much like reject these as dichotomies that have to pick one side or the other, and like you can do the both and kind of thing. Yeah.
I mean, I would say probably there is a tension actually in the field along those axes. Actually, I would agree. But I do think that some of the greatest opportunities are exactly bringing together the normative and the descriptive. I think that's where both sides acquire meaning. So we're very much in favor of collapsing that as much as possible, or at least in a very self-aware way. When it comes to philosophy-centric or science-centric, I think there's a question of publics and audiences. So, I mean, the way in which I would resolve it and talk to my students about this is we actually are doing work that talks to different audiences, and so it should be. And so it may well happen that to be able to get very good philosophical feedback, then we formulate some of our work in a way that's more philosophy-centered, that talks back to the philosophical literature in philosophy venues, and that's extremely fruitful. But it's also very fruitful to combine that with certain outputs which are much more science-centric, which actually can help us to talk to historians, talk to sociologists of science, talk to scientists. This is not the same type of writing, and I don't think it really helps to pretend that that's the case. These are different literatures, different jargons, different modes even in interaction, but I think it's really useful for our community to try and keep our foot in at least a couple of them.
So I like to think about non-ideal philosophy of science, which is both normative and descriptive. It's sort of looking at where things are now, descriptively, but also thinking, okay, how do we make it better? As opposed to thinking like, well, if I lived in a world where the only thing I had to think about was epistemic issues, then science would look like this. I mean, that's not what science is. It's not clear that we would actually want that. That to me sort of marries the normative and descriptive. and in a philosophically sort of grounded way, because non-ideal theory and political theory is like a going concern. It's really important to pay attention to the history of actual injustices in order to figure out what to do to ameliorate past injustices. Right? So I guess I've just, like, that's how you kind of blend it.
Okay, so over here on the side.
Hi. So there are a lot of conversations during the conference about collaborations between scientists and philosophers of science. It kind of has this assumption that you already have like a faculty position or a tenure, like then how to like foster these kind of collaborations. But there is a group of people like me who are like in the middle of their career, which means that I have a PhD in science, I'm doing a postdoc in science, I don't have a faculty position yet. But I wanted to, there are specific fields of philosophy of science that I really wanted to learn more with the goal of like combining the power of both, the mindset of both to do better science. But one thing I noticed is that there is really no explicit mechanisms for training and education for this kind of people, meaning that if I do a PhD, I'll have to learn a lot of things that might not be directly relevant to the science. But if I'm doing a postdoc, you have like the postdoc in philosophy of science is more like you have to be productive instead of like meant for learning and training process. So since we're talking about the future of philosophy of science, I'm just curious, like, is providing education or training opportunities for like people like me be considered worthwhile for the future of philosophy of science?
Yes, I mean, talk to Paul Huygen-Huhn. I was talking to Paul this morning for purpose, and apparently he was unemployed for 10 years after getting his. That's terrible. That should not happen, and you shouldn't have to there should be a way to bring you in. So, okay, now.
I mean, I can add a note of hope here. I think, I've been involved in setting up doctoral centers, which have exactly that aim. Right? And it has to be explicit. It's incredible amounts of hard work, but actually trying to put together training programs, I think we can all do this, those of us who have faculty positions, which are explicitly aimed at training a mixed public of philosophers, maybe some social scientists, and natural scientists coming from different fields, and basically let them choose within that training where they want to end up. So one of the programs we just is now winding down, but we did in Exeter for quite a few years, was called the Doctoral Center for Environmental Intelligence. And what we did there is train people on 3 fronts on an equal basis. One was history and philosophy of science and biology and environment. One was data science, and the other was environmental science. And we ended up with a cohort of students that may have decided to emphasize some parts of their training over others when it came to write their actual PhD. But I mean, the experience we're having now is that they're getting really good employment offers. Because in fact, in a lot of sectors, including academic, but not only, these skills are sought after. Like somebody who can, arrive and has some mathematical skills and can do some data science, but in fact, also can think more strategically about environmental questions and can do this with the capacity to articulate an argument and actually arch back to historical and philosophical issues. Gosh, I mean, our students are not getting any problem finding jobs. So I think it's feasible to do this. It may not be, I don't think it should be the main thing maybe we should concern ourselves with, but to have at least some programs who are doing this kind of work in particular areas is feasible.
I have nothing helpful to add on the general, like how do you solve this with a like a postdoc or something like this? But I have always been struck by how sort of, in some sense, accidental or non-replicatable a lot of the sort of research collaborations or research discussions, the informal ones that I've had with scientists have been. And often they just show up to talks. And then in the Q&A afterwards, they're like, oh, and now I'm going to talk to you. And there's always people at the PSA who are just like showing up to things. And one of the things, this is actually what I tell my students when I'm like, when you're picking a PhD program, you're not looking for a supervisor who works in your area. You're looking for a supervisor with whom you have that kind of magic discussion. Like it rolls forward by itself and fun things happen. And it's hard to replicate that, except you can, when you do things like go to the PSA and show up at things, sometimes you're like, okay, that discussion wasn't good. And it's really unexpected people that you wouldn't have expected it to. And you're like, wow, okay, this is fun and this is exciting. And this is the thing where I can feel like we're both getting more out of it than we had before. And the same thing at my university, it's just been like, here's a random discussion. I'm having over this boring dinner. And it turns out the person who's silent over there then contacts me, and then we do stuff. Or someone who's teaching in the room after me would start showing up earlier, and then he was like listening to the tail end of our discussions. And I was like, okay, I thought you just wanted to like set up your PowerPoints early. So in some sense, I think there's formal methods for it, but the informal methods also are more likely to give you that, like, sometimes what you need are the discussion magic with someone that you can ask those questions about, and they can give you kind of the lay of the land. And that's not a like programmatic kind of thing. So also just showing up and talking to people.
And just to say, like, in general, attending conferences of any group where you think, here there might be collaboration potential, just going to listen is probably the single most valuable thing to help orient you to what their concerns are and to figure out who you might need to talk to more. I mean, when I did that for the Society for Risk Analysis, it changed my career. So.
Okay. Thomas?
Thank you very much. Yes, it's probably a strange question concerning the future, but what role, what role, if any, do you see in there for history? I asked the question because, as a historian, and there I'm not just alone, one is sometimes dismayed to see the same old lazy narratives being repeated again and again and again. So I wonder whether, how, if anything, that might play into your perspectives.
Lazy narratives are not helpful, right? So I think like history is really important, and I think that the fact that we keep returning to different aspects of the history and seeing new stories and picking out new threads is incredibly vital, because history both allows us to see the contingencies of how we got to where we were and how it might have been different, but also we might uncover new resources each time we go to return. The problem with history is it's huge and vast and rich and complicated, and which threads and which stories. It's like the ongoing struggle, but that doesn't mean we should just ignore it or stick with the old narratives.
I'm sort of optimistic. Maybe this is just how I teach my seminars, but we really do a lot of history, and then you get to see, there are things that I thought I understood where it fit in the narrative, and then you read it, and then you realize that the narrative that you got was just incredibly false about how to situate what was going on. You're like, that's not the problem that Nelson Goodman was working on at all. So there's I think there's still a lot of people who are doing that, and they're doing it in this more kind of like integrated with contemporary stuff fashion. So I do think that we have new kinds of philosophical, conceptual tools that we can sort of look back on history with and say, oh, actually, I think there was this other thing going on. And it's really helpful to do. So a bunch of the stuff I was thinking about, the details of the foundations of causation, came out of writing this paper about Emily de Châtelet over the summer and realizing just how much her role just got covered over in a kind of narrative that you get from Kuhn. And so I think there's still a lot of stuff happening like that. So I think there's still this role for that to play, and some people are really sticking to the historical stuff.
I mean, I would agree. For me, doing history of science is constitutive of how I do philosophy. I can't actually even imagine being able to do philosophical work without doing some history as frequently as I can and talking to a lot of historians. What I do see maybe a little bit of tension, maybe just my perception, but I see a bit less, HPS work. Very typically, we think about this, at least those of us who are part of those conversations, as history of science talking to philosophy of science. I think a bit less so history of philosophy talking to philosophy of science. And I think this conference was wonderful in actually reminding many people that may be less involved with HOPOS and these organizations as to how absolutely crucial it is to think also about the history of philosophy in relation to the history of science. And it's an attempt, but because those literatures have also grown a little bit differently and they've been socialized slightly differently, I think that's where we could do much better to try and have more communication going between the two.
Okay, we're going to get one last short question here in the front. Kelly, I am sorry. I know we've got lots of questions out there.
So I wanted to come back to some of these institutional points that have been raised throughout the conference, and specifically to Alan's very nice thought experiment, which I think is not actually that wild because, just a couple of years ago, Johns Hopkins Department of Philosophy got a $75 million gift. So, I think this is a really nice invitation. I think, Sabina, you commented a little bit more about that being an opportunity to rethink the core resources and institutions. But just an observation of what else I heard, none of the ways in which y'all suggested using the money, please don't take this as a criticism, none of the ways that y'all suggested using the money included just creating more jobs for philosophers and philosophers of science, which, you know, venture capitalist people love to think of themselves as job creators. So I just wanted to invite you to maybe give us a sense of any good examples that you've seen or that you've heard of or that you've come across, even if anecdotal, of people who have been able to use their like institutional positions and their levers within the profession to kind of claw back some available jobs, maybe even increase the number of available jobs for philosophers of science, even if that's not in the academy, but it might be especially relevant to this group if you've seen any examples of that within the academy.
I do think mine would involve jobs. So I think that the Center for Causation that we should do would involve a lot of sort of standing people doing different things. I think that a lot of So my department has been weirdly successful in hiring people in the last 10 years, maybe like 8 years, largely because we're incredibly good at and conscientious about and sort of have really thought through our first year teaching that does service work for other departments. And so I think that part of what you can do is philosophers of science are really good at doing breadth requirement courses. And when you come up with good breadth requirement courses, this was like the bread and butter at HPS when I went through. And we can come up with really awesome things that are genuinely useful and fun and helpful for other departments. So I think that's a good way to get more philosophers of science in, is that we can do these like breadth requirement intro courses, but you have to have departments who are ready to pitch them in that sort of way. So that's one thought. It's not the thought experiment one, which, yeah.
Jobs, more jobs. One thing that you could do inside, you know, is have more robust, like the research ethics consultations or the embedded ethicist, and have that be a position. But that also like you need to get the administration really to take that on board. And I know of a couple of philosophers of science who have ended up in those kinds of positions. They also can put enormous strain on those individuals because they're usually cross appointments. Anytime you have a cross appointment, there's like, you know, 2 different departments that are masters, and then they both think you're not doing enough, right? So that's always really difficult. But that is a way to increase jobs. It's just, is it a good job?
And third option, maybe more relevant to the European side of the room, though, you know, some people get very big grants in the US too, is to basically have very clear and sometimes rather, you know, tense discussion with your own institutions if you're the kind of person who applies for relatively sizable grants, to make sure that people who actually get hired under those grants would have a, you know, what we would have called in the UK a proleptic appointment. So there is an agreement with the institution that you bring in a certain amount of money, then they owe you some position. I mean, certainly in Exeter we've been very successful in bringing in a lot of faculty through that then stays. There's got to be a reflection as to what that kind of emphasis on grants and project does to the field, and what kind of funders we're thinking about, and what kind of themes this pushes the field towards, which I think is not an obvious thing, because, you know, we are in a situation where only certain topics of visibility, there's huge and very, very few corporate interest in seeing certain topics explored, and so we have to be careful with that, but I think that's a potential avenue.
Let's thank our panelists.